Perfect. So, hello again, everyone. My name is Margaret Woodley, and I am the General Secretary for the National Youth Council, and I'm happy to be chairing this panel discussion this morning. We have one other panelist who's helping us with tech at the moment, who will be joining us. But first, to the guy on my right, I would like to introduce him. His name is Simpson Donovan Gabaya, and he is a member of the Men's Empowerment Network. So you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your organization?
So basically, I am part of the LGBTQI. Basically, I'm part of the LGBTQI.
Will you use the mic?
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Simpson Donovan. I'm part of the Men's Empowerment Network. Basically, we deal with MSM, men who have sex with men, and we are basically part of the LGBTQI population, vulnerable population that everyone knows. So, this link is going to be asking me basic questions, and I will be answering them to the best of my abilities.
Awesome. And yes, our next panelist, she joined us. This is Maria Fontanelle. She's the Director of Communications for the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, ECADE. So introduce yourself and tell us a little about your organization.
Good morning. As she indicated, my name is Maria. You can call me M as well. I tend to always be in the room when there's another Maria. Very common name. I am from St. Lucia. We have a secretariat based in St. Lucia. However, ECADE works across the Eastern Caribbean, not just the OECS, but to include islands such as Barbados, St. Martin, St. Croix, etc. We started our was launched in 2016, and have been working to empower and to educate and strengthen non-government organizations that deal primarily with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex rights, but also to include people living with HIV, youth, women at risk, women and girls at risk. So we work with organizations mainly, and that represent these particular constituencies. However, we do work intersectionally with the environment, etc.
Awesome stuff. And so final panelist who is joining us virtually, Arnell Mitchell, and she is from the Montgomery Chambers, Inc. Just introduce yourself for us real quick and tell us a little bit about your organization.
Sure, thank you so much, moderator. So my name is Arnell Michael. I'm an attorney at law, and I am with the Chambers of Montgomery Chambers, Inc., which is Gail Christian's office. As an attorney at law, I think in terms of adding value to this panel discussion, it would be my intention to sort of frame the legal status of LGBTQIA rights in Antigua and Barbuda right now, which will help to gear us in terms of the broader conversation about the change that would need to happen, and that is being advocated for.
Great, awesome. Our panel discussion for this morning will be centered around advocating for change on LGBT rights in Antigua and Barbuda. And with having these three different organizations, I want to get your perspective, especially from your organization standpoint, on how are you advocating for this change? Maybe what programs you have, what documents are being worked on from Ms. Mitchell's standpoint, and from the Eastern Caribbean standpoint, what is the holistic plan for the Caribbean with implementing change? So I'm repeating again. It's okay. Tell me what your organization is doing to help with this change that's needed in Antigua.
Well, for the Men's Empowerment Network, basically we have done outreach programs to basically reach out to different males, like those that are in the closets and basically do not have the family to be behind them on family support. So basically we have a whole system that they have a support system. So basically they could, confide and talk to someone from the network, and they won't have to worry about being stigmatized or discriminated against.
Awesome, awesome stuff. Yes.
From the standpoint of EKID, the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, we're working, as I mentioned earlier, one of our main areas of focus is funding for non-government organizations. So we know that the Eastern Caribbean Islands, generally speaking, are very small. And when you look at getting major funding, it is actually not in our advantage, because a lot of funders like to see certain types of results or outcomes that would indicate a major change. So when we look as a group of islands to seek funding, it's more likely to get certain types of funding as opposed to working individually as each individual island or each individual organization looking for funding. So that's one of the main ways that we have. And of course, people will sometimes try to use that against LGBT advocacy to say that, okay, we're getting outside funding. But first of all, everything in the region gets outside funding. We're colonized, we're small islands, everything gets outside funding, number one. And number two, this work is not going to get funded from internally, because what we're trying to fight is very entrenched stigma and discrimination against certain types of individuals, where the community at large will not support that kind of work. So our work, of course, must be funded by necessity externally. So I just want to point that out, because people do try to make that a case against the advocacy, which it is not. And of course, that funding is used to provide, to support rather empowerment work, to support work to strengthen the CSOs, strengthen governance structures, to help CSOs get registered, for example, as part of strengthening their governance structures, to educate people who are part of the CSO governance structure, the volunteers, etc., to do research, such as what's, as the VCDS project, to do that kind of research to support our advocacy. Our work is, our funding and our work also includes just connecting the CSOs to each other, amplifying their work through social media, amplifying their work through our media communications work as well. And one of the most important things that we do is that we have litigation happening around the region. Of course, that's an aim that we have to see how we can move towards getting the burglary and other discriminatory laws repealed. So EKID is working regionally on that level as well to change policy, to change those laws.
Awesome. So you'll be working very closely with Ms. Mitchell. So over to you, Ms. Mitchell. You can tell us a little bit about your organization, Ms. Michael, and what you guys are doing to help with advocacy in Antigua and Barbuda.
Okay, so we are not a nonprofit organization, as my fellow panelists are, but rather a law office. So in response to this question, I think what I would do is point to the most recent universal periodic review conducted by the UN that speaks to the status of LGBTQIA rights in Antigua and Barbuda, and the recommendations that came out of that working group in response to the submissions that we made on the current status in Antigua. And so the recommendations that were put forward, I think 2 recommendations came to Antigua and Barbuda from Iceland specifically, charging us as a country, charging our government to take steps to end discrimination, and stigmatization of LGBTQ+ people, including the adoption of legislation that explicitly prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I want to highlight the word explicitly because I think that is the key point of the recommendation there. And it also has been recommended that we adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and to effectively investigate violence that contravenes this legislation. So not only are we being asked by the UN and the members of the UN to put in place legislation that protects this community, but also to take the necessary steps to enforce that legislation as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. As well, I'm still about some persons that are very talented and are in some positions to make some change and truly advocate for change in Antigua and Barbuda. However, I'm going to jump over to Mr. Gavaya real quick, because your network serves as a very important tool because you can access the funding that OECS has and help to implement the legislation that Ms. Mitchell is working. Ms. Michael, I'm getting familiar with the names. Yes, Ms. Michael is implementing. So tell me a little bit about how your organization could utilize these opportunities, and not just that, but we would have heard from two panelists earlier this morning, especially the report. The report coming out of Antigua and Barbuda is very important because you have to know where you're starting, to know where you're going. So if you could shed some light on how you think it could be properly utilized to help the network of men that you guys are trying to reach out to. So how do these mechanisms and organizations in place can help your organization? Because we want it to be a collective effort and a collaborative effort, not just an organization standing alone doing it by themselves.
So basically, with the mechanisms and legislation that are being put in place, first let me state MSM basically is not really derived to only gays. It's derived to bisexuals, it's derived to guys that would have sex with men that could naturally identify themselves as being bisexual or gay. So basically with the mechanisms and legislation, we will try to reach out to every different individual that would be an MSM or identify themselves as a member of sexual. With basically the funders will come in to us, basically having workshops and trainings. We would train like government officials, officers, healthcare workers, so they would not actually how to deal with those people in the instant that you have to come in contact with them.
Okay, awesome. And I'm going to jump over to Ms. Fontenelle because you mentioned funding, and funding is very important for many organizations. So if you could maybe just run through how is the application process for funding, so that my friend over here, Gavai, can tap you on the shoulder afterwards and get some of that funding.
Yeah, the miss is not necessary. Fontenelle is fine.
Oh,
yeah. The miss and the miss. And one of the things I think that there's so many things that we do put on with naturally that actually help with the gender binaries and that help to foster that solution. And it's the Mr. and Mrs. This thing that we always do, and it's unnecessary. It's just a little thing that I try to do myself to implement in my writing, etc. Interestingly, the male empowerment network is a member of the lead. So yes, they can definitely come to us when they have proposals. When we have calls for proposals, come to us to seek funding. However, we'll send out to them to consult with them on their needs. We recently had a series of community consultations with member organizations across the region. So they would have been part of that to let us know what it is that they need. So when we write proposals in the future, we can implement according to what they have said to us their needs are. He mentioned networking, he mentioned supporting men who need emotional support, training, etc. So when we know these are their needs, then we know, okay, when we're writing proposals, implement that kind of structure into it as well. But in addition to that, we try with our media communication aspect, we try to train people in those areas where people can feel confident to engage with media. So as an organization, as you mentioned, a lot of people are on the cover, the discrimination, they don't want to face it. So instead of asking people to face up with the media, the organization can now, in its own stead, we can work with them to do press releases on issues of note, do press releases when situations happen that bring to the public's attention what the impact on LGBT people are. This research that's been done, how can we now use it to change hearts and minds in the community and let people understand the real impact on somebody's life when you are discriminated against them, the real impact on somebody's life of the laws and policies that people seem to take as part of the course. So that's the kind of assistance we can provide. And also, as EK, we sometimes put out those press releases ourselves. For example, men may not want to do it because, again, the organization might feel that they are targeted if they put out certain comments. So EK instead could put out that press statement. We don't want to interface with the Antigua media if they are willing to. And they're not always willing to speak with us unless it's a raw drama. They could make it somehow salacious. then they want to speak with us. But if it's just informative and educational, they don't tend to. But we are there to kind of do that interface for the local community. So we could put that press release out, send it to Antigua media. We don't want to have that conversation and show up in the media. But of course, we also do that when our local organization tells us to. So if we say, well, this is happening in Antigua, we feel there needs to be a press release, there needs to be a conversation, and then war, men, etc. They say, no, we don't feel that is a good idea. Then we'll not do it. Because we have to understand the local community is the one who's best place to decide whether these things will work. In terms of the policy again, people on the ground, which is why we work very closely with the member organizations, people on the ground will be the ones who will know what is happening. They'll be the ones who have been in touch with some of the policy makers. We have a meeting coming up very soon with parliamentarians for global action, where we try to get in touch with parliamentarians in each country and invite them to sit with PGA. PGA is an international organization, not at the level of, it's an NGO working with parliamentarians on how they could invest their human rights work. So we'd be that conduit of putting them in touch with these organizations and saying, hey, work together and see what you can do, because we can't admit you do that kind of work, etc., etc. So again, just working very much with the local communities and with international organizations, regional organizations to make connections and to advance human rights challenges.
Okay, awesome. You would have mentioned that men is a part of the organization already. Is there any other local organization that is a part of the OECS or the ECAID that maybe isn't here today or represented today, but you could shed some light on them because they're in Antigua and Barbuda?
For the moment, oh, by the way, just I'm sorry if I'm speaking too quickly. That is something I tend to do. So my apologies if anybody has trouble understanding me. Just so reminded myself to slow down. I get passionate on that. But no, for the moment, we do have Women Against Rape as the main organization that we work with in Antigua and the Men Empowerment Network. As I said, we work particularly with organizations representing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, also people living with HIV, and women and girls at risk, which is all right, yes, mesh. I'm sorry. Orange, not orange. Orange comes to my mind, I think of mesh. More than my apologies, I just we also work with mesh. Mesh is actually I've made my apologies. We have so many islands, I forget. My apologies on, but yes, we do work with men with mesh, which is an acronym. And it was one of our first member organizations actually to take my projects. We worked with Orange, but now they have a different head. So we do work with them significantly as well. My apologies. Yes, Mesh should be the other organization that we work with in Antigua.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to jump over to Arnel for a minute because earlier we would have heard two presentations, one with recommendations and one with a report. And in your introduction, you would have mentioned something coming out of the United Nations. Although that from the United Nations, it's very important, but what we tend to find in Antigua and Barbuda, we adopt broad-based international policies. With the recommendations and the report that were presented earlier this morning, how do you see it being incorporated into our national laws? And if you could present us with a status of our national laws so we can know how we move forward.
Okay, thank you. So I think I'll start there in terms of the status of our national laws, and I think that will help us in a starting point and to move forward to see how we can implement and advocate for this type of change. As we know, and I'm sure I have touched on in earlier presentations, we still have on the books in our Sexual Offences Act, the Sexual Offences Act of 1995, both Section 12 and Section 15. So Section 12 speaks to buggery, and that being on the books as a offense, and Section 15 speaks to serious indecency. So both those sections are ripe for challenge and ripe for change. What we have seen, and as a matter of practice, Section 12 specifically is not generally enforced, though it is still it hasn't been repealed either, but it is not generally enforced. And even that was noted in the UN report. Just for clarity as well, I'm speaking to the United Nations General Assembly report on human rights from the Human Rights Council, and that is from 2021, November 2021, so it's quite recent. So those laws are still there. I do want to note that in March of 2021, there was a challenge to the buggery law in Antigua and Barbuda, that Section 12 of the Offenses Against Persons, the Sexual Offences Act, Section 12. So there was a challenge to the buggery law, but that matter has not yet been litigated. And so it remains a live issue before the courts. But if that claim is successful, that challenge is successful, its effect would mean that that law, Section 12 of the Sexual Offences Act, would be rendered null and void by the judgment of the court. So that is a very important case to perhaps follow in terms of the progress that we are perhaps making in changes to these laws.
Okay, that's very, very, very much interesting. So I'm going to jump over to Simpson again, because what we realize is in advocating, we have to have a public presence. And for persons who maybe would have never heard of MENS, could you explain to us maybe what public campaigns you guys have ever done, or how we could maybe find you guys on a public platform, so persons that are listening to this or would have had some knowledge of this can say, okay, let me reach out, let me try a network.
Well, honestly speaking, the person that would be able to answer that would have been Mr. Etienne. But basically, we used to operate from the Ramco building. That's where most people actually found us, or know where they could have found us. But after he has taken over and he's basically like the director now, we really haven't been to the public per se. So that's still in the great.
Okay, fair enough. They were actually your social media, if the organization, no? Okay, that's fine, that's fine. Once we know the name, we know how to reach you, and there's other members that we sure could put persons in contact, especially if men, they're vulnerable and they need that network, because it sounds like a very interesting network.
Basically, if someone they reach out to me, I would basically refer them to the individual that they need to speak to whatsoever. Basically, would be referrals to who they need to actually contact and get the support and stuff like that.
Okay. I think that there's space for that approach, because dealing with persons, you need a level of confidentiality. So that approach is very much needed and welcome. Before I jump over to M and Arnell again, I want to specifically ask you on the recommendations that were presented this morning, if there's any in particular that from your experience working with this group, you could say, okay, we would have implemented any of these recommendations before, and we have maybe other suggestions and how these recommendations you see being of a great benefit to your organization.
Well, to my knowledge, advocacy is one of the recommendations that was actually dealt with this morning, and yes, it has been implemented, and I've seen a lot of improvement into it, because basically knowledge is needed, and if there is no knowledge, then no one will actually know how to deal with the matter.
Perfect. It falls right in line with our advocacy. I was like, oh, this advocacy because it's needed. And that's very great. But on the topic of advocacy, and I'm going to jump over to M now. With advocacy, you also see a level of stigma when persons come forward and even try to advocate. Do you guys see also that as an issue with the OACS and EK, and how do you try to overcome that?
one of the outcomes that was mentioned earlier is the fact that people face discrimination if they are invisible. However, invisibilizing people is also discrimination. So you have this fine balance that you need to walk. So it is necessary to be visible, especially when it comes to other people out there who are facing discrimination, young people who are questioning themselves, young people who are facing depression, thoughts of suicide, etc., because they feel like they are so different, that their families treating them negatively as a consequence of the sexual orientation or the gender identity, even their sex characteristics as well. So all these are things that you cannot change about yourself. Yet people are requiring that you present it differently or you pretend or you hide it. So visibility from people who are more confident is necessary, but acknowledging that because of our, again, it's a conundrum. Because of the discrimination, it's difficult to be visible, but the discrimination will not stop unless, well, as part of the change, there is a need for more visibility. So we try again, as I said, as I mentioned, empowering individuals, educating them to be as authentic in themselves as they can be based on their personality, etc. One of the ways is we have the Caribbean Women and Sexual Diversity Conference, which we host every year. We've been hosting it for 7 years so far. It's mostly for activists who deal with lesbian and bisexual women and transgender women, not necessarily the entire community, again, just people who identify as women or people who were born in female bodies, even if they don't identify as women. So that's one way that we specifically target a community that is traditionally less likely to be in the forefront, because we know while the research is showing what we're reading that women tend to be fetishized and people quote unquote accept, and that acceptance is something to again be queried. But people accept lesbian women or bisexual women more, or they face less discrimination than men, gay men or transgender women. But we know that we are socialized as women to be less visible, to be less vocal, so we again seek to empower women specifically to be more visible in their advocacy. But we also do that with men. We hope to have a men's conference coming soon that will work towards that, empowering people to speak on their own behalf. Because again, what we do, trying to work in country so that people in country can represent themselves. Individuals must represent themselves. You cannot always have somebody, even though just from Barbados, from St. Lucia, whatever, speaking on behalf of Antigua. People must empower themselves, but understand the barriers. So hence the policy work, where you work with government to look at protections for individuals, where you work with, where possible, lawyers, if you can afford them, to, the people in the law, you know already, I don't do back that loan and I get that BMW. So where we can afford them, we do work with the legal opportunity to help to look at where they could strengthen policy. We want to educate individuals like the police force, people working in the healthcare sector, because discrimination is not in the law. It's a choice that people make, right? Because being LGBT is not illegal. It's that certain acts that if you are involved in, and it's assumed that because you're LGBT, you are engaged in this act. But if I'm an asexual person who's LGBT, I will not be having sex. However, I will still be discriminated against, because people presume the law means that I am supposed to treat you differently because you're a criminal based on the law. So again, we work with people like in the healthcare sector, business, private sector, with the public sector to educate them that you should not discriminate against somebody because this person has no protection under the law, because you assume that they are criminal. You have no right to discriminate, and that is there's no excuse for it. So doing that education, doing those training sessions, the police and legal opportunity as well. That's one way that we help where possible.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to jump over to Arnell now. And this question is particular to the law. You have mentioned that there's changes being made to the law. And I know with most laws, in order for them to be fully enforced, they are accompanied by statutory instruments. Are there any statutory instruments that is accompanied this change in law that you can maybe shed some light on?
Okay, so there are two ways that we can seek to push forward change in the laws. So yes, we can call on Parliament to make these changes through statute, but it can also come by way of a challenge to the current law or to an undefined or unchallenged portion of the law. So a prime example there is the status of same-sex marriages in Antigua and whether or not those would be viewed as legal. that has never been challenged in Antigua and Barbuda. And if we look at the legislation that governs that marriage, if we look at our Marriage Act, and if we look at our Constitution and read those two together, there is an argument to say that there is nothing in the legislation that prohibits same-sex marriage in Antigua and Barbuda. But because there is nothing that prohibits it, can we then rightly say that same-sex marriages are legal in Antigua? I think to take that step, we would have to have one of our advocates, one of our activists challenge that law and challenge the status in Antigua and Barbuda. And that's where I think Ms. M was stating that sometimes the grassroots movement has to pair with the legal fraternity, because of course, you would have to have someone in the name to bring a claim against that action. And the support of the legal fraternity to have someone push that forward to make that challenge. What I did mention was a live case that was filed in 2021 of March of 2021, that is challenging Section 12 of the Sexual Offences Act. That's the clause that deals with buggery and makes it unlawful. But that is still live before the court. And so we do not have a judgment flowing from that. But that is a very live issue and a very interesting case. It will certainly perhaps be a catalyst to further movement in a direction of change.
Yeah, thank you for losing that, because again, when you, as you mentioned, that one case can be a catalyst for change. And you also mentioned the issue of marriage. These things that there's so much that conflicts people's personal opinion with the law. The law is, buggery is illegal. Intimate acts between people of the same sex, 2 women, 2 men, is illegal. But again, based on that, you could be fired from your job. Based on that, you cannot marry who it is that you want. Based on that, you cannot adopt a child or have a child with your partner under your name as you like it, right? So many areas of your life is affected. Based on that, you cannot get fair housing. And people feel emboldened to let you know, bold face up to your face, I'm not going to rent to you because I'm not going to rent to women. I'm not going to rent to men. Is that a man or is that a woman? So you must tell me if you're a man or woman first. Like, I'm looking at you, I can't tell if you're a man or woman. And what's your legal name as opposed to whatever name that you go by. You can't change your name or your gender to how it is that you feel. And people will feel that they will tell you you're not a man or you're not a woman based on their own perception as opposed to believing what you say. If I say I'm a man and you want to look at me and tell me I look like a woman to you, who are you to tell me I'm not a man? I know how I feel. But then we feel emboldened based on culture. And then that is almost encoded, because while there may not be explicit law that said that's the XYZ, which some cases they are, some cases they aren't. But regardless of there not being one, then there are no protections. So in addition to changing law, you have to add the aspect of providing protection for people, right? Providing protection from being fired unfairly, providing protection for being removed from your housing unfairly, providing protection from not being allowed to pursue your education without discrimination. So all these things have to be added, and you just see how that simple, quote unquote, those 1-2 lines in the law just kind of ripple and could destroy somebody's life, not allow somebody to live their life to the full extent that they can and enjoy their life to the full extent that they can. And a point that was also made this morning, to contribute to society to the full extent that they can. There's so many LGBT people who are currently working in every area of life and contributing so magnificently, but they cannot say, I have a different sex orientation, because then they may be prevented from doing so simply by just the attitude of their co-workers, simply by the attitude that they work with, and then more explicitly by being denied the opportunity by being fired or removed or denied promotion, etc. So these few laws are just affect so much of people's lives, and we hope that, which is why we have to absolutely obey the law. Politicians are very scared of making certain statements because they know how, as a community in the region in particularly, that we've we cling so strongly to Christianity, and we believe so much the things that have been said. It's almost like, I think Christianity in some ways almost it's like an oral history, because so much of what people say they hear from somebody, they have not read it in the Bible themselves. But Christianity is almost like an oral history. It's not even like in some instances, it does not even seem like a real thing. Because the people who will discriminate against you because it's in the Bible, because God said, you ask them where. Where in the Bible? Please explain it to me. Show me where. Explain it to me how it applies. They can't tell you. Then support it with other things. They can't. But so it's almost like an oral history, but it's so entrenched that it is, for you to protest against, it's almost like you are being this alien from outer space that, what are you talking about? Can you not understand? So another aspect of the work again is that education, that sensitization that we have to do in small pockets. We don't do it with the police officers, do it with the community themselves. Because people also have that internalized stigma. Because you grow up hearing the same messages, you grow up hearing that it's wrong to be gay. And then you're like, but I'm gay, so I'm wrong. Something is wrong with me. So the movement is doing so essential to let people understand that you are fine just the way you are. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just people that don't understand. And these organizations that kind of level is very important, and sensitizing the general public who may not identify as or who needs to understand how people feel is also very important. So it's working on the policy level, working on empowerment of the community themselves, working on the public education. So many areas, so much work to be done.
Okay, awesome. Because that would have me right into my final question. If I open up the floor for questions, and you would have said it, you have touched on it very, very, very deeply. And I was going to ask, what is one suggestion that you could give that on an individual level that we can help with advocating for this change? So a person's listening, or a person that I'm attending here, within my own self, or within my own small group, I can help advocate for this change. And I'm going to start with Donovan. I'm going to start with him, and then I'm going to just Arnold and come back to you, Adam. What is one small recommendation that you would give so that on individual level we can help with advocating for this change?
Okay, so basically, as I said before, information is key. If you want to have the information, then you won't be able to divulge that information to anyone else. So basically, I would say, basically we could do like, as I said, we do a workshop and we do a training, and basically those information that those individuals get from that actual workshop or training, they could then pass on that information to maybe family members, different friends. Because people, as Arnold said, Em said that those people, if they don't know the information, then they won't be able to actually they internalize the norm as in what they learn from the Bible or what they learn as growing up, or maybe one of their friends come to them, peer pressure is real. And you maybe might know certain things, but because you're in a group or you're in a peer, they will pressure you to actually believe that what they believe is what is actually true. But then that information that you learn from being in a workshop or advocating or whatever, you will actually then relay that information to your same peer, educate them, and then they in turn will actually divulge that information first.
So, and then I'm going to jump to Ardell. What is one recommendation you would give to a person so that within their own individual spaces they can advocate for this change?
Right. I think as Ms. M would have highlighted, there is a difference, and it is when we're talking about advocating for change, we're talking about a multifaceted approach. So there is certainly a difference between one's personal beliefs. There's a difference between our culture as a society, and then there's a difference between those two things and the law. So those are three very distinct and separate categories, and we must be careful not to conflate the three. In terms of a personal question that everyone can perhaps ask themselves when thinking about this topic and thinking about advocating for change is whether or not, on the basis of their personal beliefs, something, an act, an identity, and a community should be criminalized or should be discriminated against. Because there are many things that we may have personal beliefs about that we may not think should happen, that we may or may not think are right or wrong. But that does not naturally mean that it should be legislated against. And I think we have to ask ourselves personally if we should have a distinction between the rights and protections that are allowed for in law and our own personal beliefs. We can work on personal beliefs. That can evolve and change over time as is necessary and as each individual is moved to do so. But should the law wait on that personal evolution?
Okay, and I'm going to end with M.
Thank you. I think my recommendation kind of encompasses some of what was said. I mean, I love that pressure. Peer pressure is real. That's very true. But my advice is I will do self-promotion and promote a campaign that we have, Speak Love. And we try to highlight some of the more spiritually based comments that people have made, of spiritual people who make comments advocating equality. So speak love in any space that you are. If you're in any space and you hear somebody saying something that is discriminatory, be the one to speak up. And that, could you imagine, as a policymaker is determined to ensure where whatever space they are, there's only positivity in that space. Sometimes when there are laws enacted that seek to discriminate unfairly, you might be that voice that might say we need to do this because this is not a positive action, right? So let's just try to speak love where you are. You see somebody walking down the street, somebody's watching them in a particular way or making certain statements. You don't want to say, hey, is that necessary? Or why do you feel the need to question why do you feel the need to say that? What does it accomplish? Because I often find that discrimination accomplishes nothing. When you insult somebody, what are you doing? Like, what is your purpose in doing that? What's your positive purpose? So it's speak love and of course apply the law where get off your assigned seat and act. Don't always be silent. Don't always be silent. But speak love and apply the law where.
Okay, awesome. I want to open the floor now for either persons online or persons here with us in the room today. If there's any questions that you have for any of our panelists, feel free to do so now. Okay, 1 second. We have one person. Okay, no problem.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Grace Charles. I'm a program officer at the Directorate of Gender Affairs. And my question is to you, Em. I think you touched on this a bit earlier, but I wanted to see if you could expound. In the context of everything that you said today in terms of the government in particular and their hesitation around advancing progressive LGBT inclusive policy, particularly because of religious attitudes and cultural stigma, what are the ways that government can work with organizations like yours to help reduce that stigma in a way that is disruptive, but in a smart way? Disruptive, but in a way that can actually open the minds of our population, as opposed to just inciting aggravation and all of that negativity that sometimes comes when we try to talk about these issues. Next one.
Thanks, Raisa. That's a really good question, and that's a really smart question as well. Ike has been trying to, one of the things that we try to meet directly with representatives, in their office, have a close meeting with them and just explain what it is that we do. And some of the recommendations that we have speak exactly to that. So simply things like, for example, you have an activity with other policymakers, for example, or the embassies, etc. Invite a representative of an NGO. When you have a little cocktail, etc., invite a representative, because then that person will be in the room with other individuals or also policymakers, other quote-unquote Christian people, etc., and they speak for themselves in that space. When you have your meetings, your trainings, etc., your consultations, make sure NGOs that represent marginalized communities ensure that they are on that list. Make sure that they are invited. Make sure that you give them, because again, the human capacity, the human resources limited. Make sure you call them up and say, hey, did you get this email? We're having this consultation, whether it be a consultation on providing water in a community or about sexual and reproductive health and rights. Make sure these people are at the table make sure somebody's at the table. And it doesn't have to be, you have to tell the public, I'm inviting LGBT, I'm inviting everybody, right? Make sure you invite people to everything that you can invite them to, and that you also network and introduce them where they can be introduced, that you send opportunities their way that you're aware of, if you're aware of a funding opportunity, make sure that they're aware of it as well. Those who are involved in doing things like public policy campaigns, when you do a campaign, the same way you'd say it right now, it's derogatory to say it, like you have different races, etc. you represent. Make sure you also represent couples that look different, people that look different. If you can slide that into your public campaigns, you know, that's a very easy thing to do. So instead of having everybody like a man that look like a man and a man that woman that look like just like what we traditionally expect for a woman, and having them head up in that way. 2 different family types, ensure that you represent that where possible. But I think what we've told them most importantly is just try to make sure that NGOs that represent marginalized communities are in your database and that you invite them to everything that you invite them to and let them speak for themselves. And also we have training that we offer, like about the empowerment trainings. Try to organize that with your staff, with the ministries that you are in charge of. For example, the Minister of Legal Affairs, that's a ministry in your country, right? So is in charge of police. So if I have a meeting with the Minister of Legal Affairs, I say, can you organize a training, stigma and discrimination training? Because we did a manual. You can have a manual on our website, www.bcequality.org. So you can go there and get the stigma and discrimination manual, and we could ask again to any of our members, any of the countries, can you do a training for our police officers? Can you do a training for our nurses? That's another way that they can do that.
There's a more.
Hello, I'm Gemma Handy, the Managing Editor of the Observer Media Group. I have a question for you. 2 years ago, I wrote an article about how EPAID was challenging the so-called buggery law in 5 different Eastern Caribbean countries. You gave us the update on the Antigua and Barbuda one, but I'm curious as to what is the status in the other 4 countries. I think it was St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Kitts, and Dominica.
Hi, Gemma. Thank you. One of the things, all these cases are currently ongoing. That's as much as we are saying. For several reasons. For part of all the things that we've mentioned here today, we are trying to reduce the public information around the cases. Like it's a live case, so obviously public information would be reduced because you don't want to sway or influence either way. So we're not providing updates. And as far as when those cases, the judgments are called, we have not decided that we will actually do public facing campaigns as well for, again, the protection of the community. People always feel like when you do advocacy and you get a quote-unquote win, and you should celebrate by making it as public as possible. But what they do not take into consideration is that I cannot be where where he is. I cannot protect him. So while I had an organization would be like, yeah, we spent all this money, we did all this work, hallelujah, we got this win, and promote it. When he's on a dark street being attacked, I am not there. We could only provide so much protection. So we are balancing how much public information that we put out. Number one, to not influence the case unnecessarily. And number two, to manage as much as we can the impact on the local community. Because we found, I've been involved in this work, as I said, EK is will be 6 years old in June. Previous to that, I worked for a local organization, United and Strong in St. Lucia. We have found in every instance, every time there is, we do it anyway because we have to, as I said, visibility is necessary. So we try to be the ones to interface with the media. However, we find that even when it's an organization, an individual, even when there's news about some judgment or some situation in another country, there is somebody who comes back and said, some person left me in the street and they find an uptick in the verbal abuse and the identification of them as LGBTQ plus persons, and a need almost to punish them to prevent the advance of the progress of LGBTQ plus rights. So we do try to balance giving public information with understanding that every time that we do so, it has an immediate impact on people on the ground. So the cases are all ongoing. Hopefully, good outcomes, but it's the way it is.
Awesome. Is there any other?
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentations. I actually have a question for both Gavaya and Gavaya, let me start with you. In terms of your outreach and your presentation, it sounded more of a traditional who knows and shares with somebody else. But what about the persons who are not in that network already? Does your organization have any plans to expand and extend their services to individuals that would need your support services, but they're not even in contact with anyone who is not already in contact with your organization? And for my question is, and I don't know if the grade is still she's left. She's out. Oh, okay. But Dr. Schuler. She's still in there? Okay, well, I guess this question is for both her and I know St. Lucia to be, I think Catholic is the dominant religion, right? I know one of the suggestions or recommendations in both online presentations was the appeal to gently get the religious community on board. How has that been in St. Lucia? And if it has been successful, or if you've seen that transformation take place, what are some of the things that you guys have done to at least get the religious community to begin thinking like that?
Okay, so to answer your question, I'm going to give you like a scenario. Basically, there was this incident where a young individual from college, basically he was a part of men's or whatever it is. So because of we actually had the workshop with like different other people and they went out and gave out that information. The individual that actually got information already was actually going to college at the time. So when the incident happened, they learned about the incident about them, and then they decided to actually contact one of us, which in turn they actually mediated between the individual and the said person that actually ended up being in the predicament at the time, and then we took it from there and went on with the process.
That's insane. For someone who is not present that knew about you, right? Because I was taking you for the other, your men empowerment.
Yeah.
All right, I was taking you for male empowerment. So back I was like, I didn't know there was groups in MSM. And then I was like, oh, it's two different networks, right? So I didn't know about men empowerment network before this morning and hearing you and all the good work you've been doing. So for individuals who have never heard about you, don't know your services, and unfortunately may not be in proximity of someone who does know about you, what are your plans to extend those services to the persons that don't know about you at all?
Well, so far I'm not really privy to any of that information to what's going forward. So I will have to dialogue with Mr. Etienne to actually get that information to them.
And you meet your mic at this So it's okay, no, it's okay, then have feedback. There'll be the feedback.
What I would like to say is that even though the ECADE members in Antigua have different mandates, we work together, and we have an intra-referral network that is very active. So in some instances, people may call us and we can direct them either to MEN or to MESH or any other organization. And the same goes for the other organizations that are a part of ECADE that exist in Antigua and Barbuda. We keep it intra-network because we want to prevent harm. They all do no harm. Because as much, and I think M mentioned this, as much as we want to have the public advocacy, we have to measure it against the risk. And because Antigua is so small, I remember when we were doing our domestic violence research, a mention was made of secondary school in the eastern area. It's only one secondary, at that time was one secondary school, so right away you know they were talking about peers secondary school. So as much as we would like to get out there are certain paths we have to tread cautiously. So if you contact men and they know it's a case for women against rape, they will refer it, and vice versa with MESH as well. Because we keep in contact with each other, and we have done projects together through funding that was organized by ECADE as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, social media really works. Before, it would be more like, before, for example, somebody might come to the attention of a principal or somebody in gender affairs or somebody in social services who might know of that organization and refer people. So there have been networks on the ground that have existed before, but social media is also important. Like WAR has an active social media presence. We have found that ECADE regionally, and we still find people sending us inbox messages and saying, hey, I'm in Barbados and I need help. I've gotten messages from Canada, from Africa, from everywhere. That people inbox you and say, I need help. What can you do to help me? So we, of course, do that referral, contact this organization that works in your country, XYZ. So social media helps, but there's also always been some kind of network that would, a lot of people would see, or they know when somebody has issues or is of a different sexuality, and they know who to connect them with, especially those with social services and those kind of organizations. With regards to the question about the religious connection, the campaign I spoke about previously, Speak Love, it's a little campaign because we don't have that much funding. So, we try to do what we can where we can. So it's mostly a graphic campaign that we do online, and I actively reach out to individuals. I seek out statements by individuals who are of a religious persuasion to highlight those comments, because people listen to people like them. So if there is, whether it be Desmond Tutu who recently passed, again, he's a friend of mine has recently passed, or there was a retired pastor in Barbados, Anglican Christian Barbados, who was part of Pride in Barbados, and who spoke very openly about the fact that he finds no problem with people of different sexuality. So highlight those comments. We have tried to hold several sensitization sessions with faith-based organizations to be a success. I remember the first one that we held, we sent out the information, we said what it was, faith and sexuality. People don't always read the fine print, but it said faith and sexuality was the name of the session. People came into the room, sat down. Then when the moderator started speaking, there was a gentleman from the US and his husband, and they started speaking. People actually literally got up and they just like, out. We don't want to hear. We don't want to know. We don't want to engage. So we don't do it in that sense as much anymore in terms of holding like an actual training session, etc. But there is an organization that works regionally that connects faith-based, particularly people of different sexuality and gender representation who are very strong in their faith, try to connect them with people within that faith, with people who are heads of certain faith sectors, and have that conversation happen organically as much as possible. I know PLHIV organizations, especially in Jamaica. Jamaica has a very strong network where faith-based organizations are concerned, and they continually do that work directly with them, not in the public eye necessarily, occasionally in the public eye, but generally on a one-on-one basis, engage with them, speak with them, but more so empower activists who are working with these marginalized communities, empower them so that when they are in their churches, in their mosques, in whatever areas they are, that they can speak on behalf of the community and make the connection as well.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that network conversation because there's also youth organizations that are heavily a part of that network, and we communicate often. So I know there's the National Youth Parliament, there's Youth Arising, there's even the National Youth Council, who members of these organizations sit on WAR or even on men, and we communicate. So if we know of something, we speak to the relevant person to get persons in contact and communication. So yes, and I see Senator had a question.
First, let me say good afternoon, everyone. Yes, first, let me just commend the interviewer. Ms. Woodley, you're doing a wonderful job as usual. Your panelists. Also, WAR, to whom I'm a member of and I'm an advocate for. And the CDS project, because I think this is so important for us to marry the information we're trying to get out there. Anything surrounding the LGBTQI community. What the CDs have done, and I've been a part of the project from the onset, is to marry it with child abuse. I think if we do this going forward with any project, we can really get the word out. Because what you don't want to do, you mentioned it about inviting key population, the nurses, the politicians, to these types of sessions. But then you don't want to come straight out and just talk about LGBTQI. If you talk about child abuse or some other topic, gender-based violence, sexual abuse, or something else that would grab their interest, I think that will work. Regarding the legislative process now, we know we have a lot of elder politicians in Parliament, not just in Antigua and Barbuda, but across the world, right? And they are mainly set in their ways as to the Bible teachings. Only a woman can marry to a man. So in order for us to try and have some sort of legislative reform, we need to reach them. And that would be by inviting them to sessions like this. I know Senator Gail Christian should have been here, but unfortunately she wasn't able to. But then what we need to do is invite the ministers. We have conferences, you invite Honorable Samantha Marshall, Minister Dean Jonas, because he's the Minister of Social Transformation. Get them to be a part of it. This way we can get their buy-in, then we can have some sort of law amended and tabled in Parliament. We have to reach them. Now we say Antigua and Barbuda and the Caribbean, we are Christian society, yes. But the whole fear about politicians changing laws that will make it more inclusive or include the LGBTI population. They don't want to create an uproar with the Christian society. So then we need to get into the churches. There are a gay person or a lesbian person in every church. They may be in a closet, but how can we find at least one or two members in each one of these churches, reach out to them and try to gain their interest, and then they can take it to the higher ends. So the networking and the intra-communication between organizations is necessary. With men, I think you guys need to do much, much more in terms of social media presence and so forth. Because once you join with Mesh, Mesh joins with WA, and we're all networking together, we can get successful in our endeavors, right? Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I am going to give my panelists the opportunity to give their final words, and then we'll close off our panel discussion for today. I'm going to start. Oh, yes, if there's anybody that has questions for Dr. Ned. Oh, okay, there is a question at the back.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to add a little bit. I think I'm not hearing much about the medical personnel. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I'm Anita Joseph. I'm representing the Labor Commissioner from the Labor Department. Yes, I'm thinking that in as much as we're talking about inclusivity, I would want to think that the inclusion of medical personnel, because for us, these are not normal. These are sometimes we look at the LGBTQT plus as we're from a society where we're cultured and it's the norm that we accept, male and female, and that's it, full stop. But as we progress, we realize that persons are demonstrating more than that. So I would want to think that at this point, the medical fraternity should be very much in the forefront of things, maybe to explain that this is not only person preference, it's all, sometimes has to do with genes and people, medical makeup and so forth. So in doing our campaign in education, I think the medical fraternity plays a great role. And yes, we know persons don't want to step on each other's toes, they don't want to offend, but they need to come out also and speak and let persons understand. And we're doing it from kindergarten. Because in school, we are taught male and female, anybody outside of that, it's really, you're from space. So I think the education needs to start there. We are going to be targeting children as young as soon as they start to speak, they start to understand, so they can learn to accept each other. So that is my tidbit. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Harrigan. Representing the Special Needs Ministry of Education, that vulnerable population. I'm also an advocate, and I have not only been advocating, but I am counselor psychotherapist as well, providing support for all vulnerable populations. One of the things that I find that is critically important for the community is that we zero in on the self. You cannot pour from an empty cup. We need to access and advocate for the community members to self-actualize, help them to realize themselves and where they want to go and need to go, empower them so that they have the strength to advocate for themselves. We can do as much as we want to do. We can beat drums, we can swing flags, but if they're not there to advocate for themselves, if they are not self-actualized and they cannot find the motivation to push individually and collectively, many of us who are with them and supporting them will be beating a dead horse. So we need to give individuals that support, whether it's institutionally or group by group, or providing support and resources so that they can access this type of help and support to realize themselves. We need to start there. After that, empowerment becomes important. They need to earn a living, they need to be empowered academically, and everybody will not go and write CXC or C-select subjects, but they can become functionally literate and numerate and become entrepreneurs so that they can support themselves. That is another avenue that I think needs a lot of push in that direction so that they can become entrepreneurs. They support themselves, the businesses that spring up, many of them are so creative, so talented, and it's a lot of talent just sitting down there and going to waste. A lot of potential that is just laying there. So we need to find ways to empower them so that they can become entrepreneurs and contribute not only for themselves, families, the communities, but society at large. They are members of our society. They are not going anywhere. Thank you.
We want to open the floor if there's any questions specifically to the research that is being done by Dr. Esper. If there's any questions at all, she would want to address as well.
I can offer some thoughts on the last two comments, although I'm hearing some feedback, I don't know. Okay, so I just have to follow up on the last two comments. Somebody was, Ms. Joseph was asking about the health community, and the Harrigan was asking about the empowerment of the community itself and advocacy. I wanted to say that in the full research report, which I encourage you all to read once it's published on the website, we take note of both those categories. Health workers were interviewed as part of stakeholder groups, cisgender, heterosexual group, LGBTI group, and key informants. We had persons from the medical profession, private doctors, as well as emergency workers, fire safety workers across the board. And their input is represented in a large portion of what we see in the data and in the analysis and the findings that we have. Additionally, I would say there's a strong representation of health forms and medical forms in the intake forms that were analyzed for to assess representation. And unfortunately, the medical forms and health forms themselves reflect that gender and sexual orientation are not as adequately represented even in the medical field. So that's one area. While many members of society, of the LGBTI community, were saying, yes, I feel comfortable going to a healthcare worker and being able to disclose my sexual orientation in order to seek services, particularly when it related to HIV testing, AIDS testing. I think DOGA has done quite a bit of work. The AIDS unit as well has done quite a bit of work in that area. We did get some data from that unit as well. What we are finding, there's one particular interview where the respondent noted that it would be really useful to see more public education and education within the LGBTI community about gender affirming processes from a health perspective. People were taking risks and doing things in a sort of underground kind of way, which poses so many dangers in terms of hormones and so on. So one of the participants actually said, it would be great to have doctors and nurses and medical professionals who understood trans identity and understood gender affirming transitioning processes and were able to educate even within the LGBTI community on how those things happen and what the terms are, because people are taking chances with their lives. People are going through less legitimate means to do their transitions because they are so afraid or they have no access to services. And this can pose dangers. This can have public health implications. This can cause people to die in the most extreme circumstances. And so there is a concern that the health professions across the board, medical and health professions, need to be leaders in terms of education, not just for a matter of broad public education, which is critical as we have discussed in all of the sectors, but even within the LGBTI community in helping and supporting LGBTI persons to have both gender affirming and sexual orientation support in terms of best practices, best health practices, consistent healthcare regardless of their status. And so I wanted to say that we did get feedback from health professionals in the study, and so you will see some of that reflected, but there were some notable points like the one I just mentioned coming in from the respondents themselves asking for what they need, which leads me to my second response for the comments about advocacy and advocates. The research report reflects the recommendations reflected in the research report represent what we are getting from the respondents, right? These are not, oh, well, yes, we, as a researcher, it's my job to come to conclusions and other conclusions, but these are consistently informed by the data that we are getting from the LGBTI respondents based on their experiences of stigma and advocacy. I want to say in response to that, I just want to make a note that LGBTI persons are universally saying that yes, they require advocacy and access and they want support, but they also recognize and know within their community, whether people are out or people are not out publicly, that LGBTI persons exist at all stratas of the society, from the highly educated and affluent to the lowest working class or to the indigent poor. They exist everywhere. They're in your supermarkets, they're in your legislators, they're in your legal and health professions. They know the communities, they know people who are out, they know people who are not. And while there was a lot of protection of each other in the data that we collected, a number of respondents said, you will be surprised by who is this person. You will be surprised by who is this person. And a lot of that is coming from, their sort of vernacular discourse about it. But it's also good. It's also good for us not to make assumptions that there is no access or that there is a certain sort of class bracket that people belong to because they are disenfranchised. Disenfranchised people exist across the social strata. And this is one of your privilege might exist in one way, and then you might be disadvantaged in another way. I may be privileged because I have high education, but I may also be, I am a left-hander and I am discriminated against because everything is designed for people who are right-handed, right? So in one area of your life, you might be extremely privileged, but there is another area that you might not. And the same thing applies in LGBTI areas. You may think that, oh, you're looking at someone on the surface and they don't publicly talk about their sexuality or their gender identity or anything like that, and they seem to have it all together. And so that person is not as in need of empowerment or in need of access in the same way. But that's a false assumption to make, or it's conflating certain assumptions that we make in society where we need to empower a certain way. Granted, I do take the point that there needs to be a way for across the social sphere, across the public sphere, for people to feel more empowered to come forward and support each other and build a stronger network within LGBTI communities. And there are things that we discuss, particularly the separation. I like the comment about separating the legal from the perception, from the public opinion pool, right? You have to really not conflate those things in order to be able to address them very carefully. That we have to provide empowerment, but also understand that this is a diverse community, like any other group that is advocating for resources. There's diversity in that group, and yes, they need empowerment, but part of the empowerment is acknowledging that some of them are able to speak for themselves. And this is one area where I think the research report will really, really be useful, because they are telling us very clearly what they want. They've said, the government doesn't say we are discriminated against. The government doesn't say harm people, but it doesn't do anything to help us when we are harmed, right? There's a lot of commentary coming from law enforcement and saying law enforcement will come, but generally the attitude is, those things happen. And this is not unlike other types of disenfranchised groups like women or even men who face domestic violence situations. There is and a lot of the respondents have made those correlations. It's like, what we're experiencing is bad, but it's not just bad for us, like this kind of this category. So there are ways that there is a lot of nuance in the research that I think is really important for us not to make these sort of blanket. Yes, this is an advocacy dialogue, and we're passionate today, but it's in the details, right, that we have to think about what how this is framed. And then the last example, to go back to an earlier comment that I wanted to expand on, was the religion aspect. Quite a few of our participants, we also sought to have stakeholders represented who were faith leaders or representing religious communities. We even part of our youth focus group and our youth respondents in the cis-heterosexual group will identify. We had about, I would say, 75% of the persons who were cisgender identified as Christian, and some of them were actually leaders in their church or leaders in their community. We had a pastor as one of our stakeholders. We had representation. What we heard over and over again is, and this is something I was, as a researcher, I had my own researcher lens, had to really deal with some conflict there, because we kept seeing the language of, we love the person, not the lifestyle, which is coming up against UN reports, right? UN human rights instruments that saying this is not a lifestyle, it's somebody's life, right? At some point, even some of the respondents in the LGBTI community are talking about, well, they are welcoming to us, but it's a step, right? They're almost internalizing the fact that this is not so bad because they're loving the person, not the lifestyle, even especially when talking about their family members who needed time to adjust to them coming out or things like that. They'll say, my family is very religious, and it was very hard for them. I didn't want to bring shame for them at church. One particular respondent said, I didn't want my mother to be embarrassed at church, as an example of, the framing of it as a social stigma on the person who is a cis heteronormative person, and not necessarily on themselves. They're thinking about the shame and stigma for someone else, right? Who is in a position of a more privilege. And so you see this dialogue coming up where someone said, well, we have these people who come to our church, but they cannot be leaders in the church. Even if we accept them in the church, they cannot be leaders in the church because they are. And so it's problematic, it's troublesome, because are we like, I don't want to get the Montgomery Chambers representative name wrong. Are we going to just wait until they come all the way for us to say that we're going to take legal action, or there's going to be a challenge? Because I think that opening with the marriage, the same-sex marriage, is a real opportunity for a challenge based on what the research is saying. Like, this is an opportunity. And I actually saw a social media dialogue going on about it in the context of Antigua right after we had submitted the draft of the report a few months ago, saying, well, nobody even thought of that. It doesn't actually say two persons of the same gender cannot get married. Who is going to test this out? Let somebody go. Let's just two of us just go down to the court and try to get married. And it was like a joke on social media at the time, but it's an important challenge, because that challenge really doesn't have anything to do with the religious leadership, does it? It's a challenge to the law. And so if we think about those things can exist separately, and we can work on them separately, but there has to be a really understanding that waiting for that religious and cultural shift, it's waiting in a way that the religious representation of cisgender heterosexual persons and the stakeholders invested in religious leadership have told us, this is the best we're going to do. We don't discriminate. We don't encourage discrimination. We are here with you, supporting that everyone should have rights. But we cannot stand for it, because like I said in my presentation, that buggery law, that Sexual Offences Act of 1995, is giving them a sort of a veiled sort of protection that they imagine in their minds that it has, protecting the children, protecting the society, right? Even if it doesn't actually do anything, like all the academic research is telling us, even if it actually doesn't change any behavior, just having it there makes us feel better that we are safe, right? And so you want to think about what that means. If you're waiting for that support in order to go move the laws, then you probably have to rethink that strategy. And I would want to just offer, based on the desk research, one last thing is that look to what's happening in Latin America, in South and Central America. There's been a lot of work, a lot of change to legislation happening in South America right now, in Latin America, that can give useful models for how advocacy groups can move forward. That's a lot of the research is coming out of Colombia and Ecuador and places like that right now, where they're having major legislative shifts. I think it's a useful context, particularly with the religious aspect, to think about how the legislators there and the advocacy groups there have managed to shift the legislation so much in such a broad context. So this is it will be a good model for us to learn, as it's referenced in the research report. So those are my comments.
Awesome.
Yes, Dr. We don't leave yet. I heard you mention parents and their involvement, in particular to a person, and I think revealing something in church. In doing your research, what sort of feedback did you get from parents in acceptance to their children being LGBTQ and the rest of it? Because what I'm looking at, once parents, maybe we need to do some more workshop for parents in terms of how do they look at their children. I know we're living in small societies, so it's not going to be easy, to accept. But once we get parents to accept those lifestyle, maybe, just maybe, we can curb some of the suicidal attempts, because from some accounts, we know once persons have difficulty revealing their sexual preferences, they find it hard to fit into society and often resort to suicide. So once they know that their parents, yes, it's difficult for your peers to accept, but once you know your parents can accept your lifestyle, I think that too can help. So how did you find in your research parents' acceptance to that form of lifestyle?
Well, this was mixed. So I want to say something, that the research for this particular research focused on adult participants, right? 18 years of age and older. I vaguely remember now, we've been working on this for a long time, that one of the cisgender participants was a parent of someone, or a close family relative of someone who was identifying as LGBTI. Most of the perspectives that we had about parental involvement came from LGBTI persons themselves, disclosing their relationships with their parents and what they needed. We asked them some significant questions: do you publicly identify as an LGBTI person, and what support have you received, or do you need to receive in order to if you are public, if you are out, what support did you receive, or if you are not out, what support do you feel that you need to receive to reveal your status to the public, right? Those were some of the research questions that we asked them in the interviews. Those questions revealed a lot about parents and family and community and how that support worked. Most of them said that their family member, like a mom or a mother figure, was the first person that in their family who they came out to or who gave them support at home, but they sort of agreed in a dialogue to not disclose to the public or not have public discussions around it. There were a minority group that had very vocal public support of their children. One person said that they came out to a close family member, a mother figure in a high school, and that was a comfort for them because that person was very sort of progressive and liberal and understood and helped them to bring the other family members along. But for another probably about half of the group, either people who were out or people who were not yet public, they said that their biggest fear was about their family members and having the support of their family members who were, some people reported getting put out of their homes or getting shunned by family members, and that is still difficult. So the research is saying that And most of the reasoning around it is around very strong perceptions of how other people will view the family and view the parent or the family members, right? So we're seeing either from a church perspective or just a society perspective in general. There's a lot of fear of what other people might say across the board in that. And this is pretty common in our Caribbean culture. I'm from Dominica, and it's the same thing. Everybody, even if you're heterosexual and you have any kind of, there was one point that was made. I remember Miss Gray and I having a sort of in a peer review conversation around this. You know, are these behaviors about being public displays of affection or so on just about homosexuality or bisexuality, or are they about just sexuality in general and how we are Puritan as a culture and don't want to see people public displays of affection are not encouraged? Even if you're in a heterosexual relationship, people will look at you, or people. So even some of the things that we think are just simply, they have a double layer, right? So there's the original layer that people don't really want to, people know everybody's having sex and having children and all of these things, but they want to see it in their public face, even if it's in a heteronormative way. And so that added layer of putting it in public and having it in what they perceive to be deviant way is an additional transgression, right? So all of these layers about public perception and how people view, how stigma is created in Caribbean culture is really important to the conversation. That said, the parent issue is one that I think really needs to, I think it's the same Harrigan person who just asked me this question. I just want to be clear, I tried to get the voices. You're working in the Ministry of Education. We had a Ministry of Education representatives here. My recommendation, I work with young people a lot in my work, and I work with late adolescents in a non-profit organization as well. And I can tell you from my experience that peer groups are probably the strongest, as this research is telling me. Peer groups have been the strongest point of support for these for people who come out especially at young age. So the youth focus groups and LGBTI persons who were below the age of 30 were saying that my friends have been the greatest support. They don't care. We go out, we have a good time, and they have been the most accepting of my life and my identity and understanding it. And they sort of don't have any explaining to do, because they sort of know, they grew up in a culture, especially a lot of them have cited, larger access to internet and social media as making it easy for people to learn on their own about the different identities, and therefore there is sort of less work for them to do in constantly having to explain themselves, and they find that their peer groups are a good first stage in doing that. So I think that's where groups like the National Youth Council can get involved in helping parents and helping young people to develop scripts to talk to their parents about this, helping them develop language and the terminology and stuff like that to be able to support each other in conversations with possibly not just parents or parental figures, but aunts and uncles, cousins, and the extended family network that is known for in our Caribbean culture that really does help support the family and bring people along. I think it's not just, let's just let parents know that from kindergarten they should talk to. We want, like I said, we have to move all the engines at the same time, but we also have to account for what is going to actually push us forward instead of putting up a roadblock. And sometimes it's not just I'm looking forward to some of the child rights conversations around that, because a lot of the fear and a lot of the obstacles to discussions around that is about this idea of protecting children, right? How do we take out the lens of this is something to protect? What are you protecting a child from if that child is themselves identifying already that way? And then the second part is taking out the sex out of the conversations around LGBTI. So much of the conversations around sexual orientation and gender identity happen around buggery laws and sexual activity, and not about these are people who have identities and that's just one aspect of their lives. Like I was saying, it's all facets of society. All kinds of people have these. Yes, it is important, and the buggery law is critical to that for the purposes that we're talking about, but we also want to have a fuller scale conversation about LGBTI identity, because then it says we have all these other things in common, and then this one thing you're harping on it even if you can't see it and you don't know anything about it, We have the same education. We have the same hair color. We have the same background. We have the same everything else. We like the same food. We like the same car. Then what is it, right? If we take out the conversation or the focus on protecting children and this kind of sexual deviance part, what are the things that are bringing people together, or what kinds of advocacy can be created out of this conversation? So I think the parents part is important, but we have to use our extended network. We have to use our extended families, and we have to use the peer-to-peer support coming from you in order to make that possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. Esprit. I know based on your presentation this morning that you would have liked some more room, so we're grateful that you were able to respond in this manner. Sir, what happened there? But you did something. Sorry about that. But just for education, in the Caribbean, there is the Health and Family Life Education syllabus. It is used from the uppermost north down to the farthest south. Now, that syllabus is what is utilized in most of our schools for educating our children. Do you see a modified, a more recent, up-to-date model of that health and family life curriculum making a difference, as what Joyanne spoke about and what Ms. Joseph from the Labor Department spoke about? If we could have your brief comments just before we break for lunch.
I wish,
Where's the story there?
but can you hear me? All right. Oh, there's a little feedback. I think something needs to be muted. Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Right. Very good question, Ms. Wong. I will tell you that I have worked in different ways on advising on the CXC syllabus for English A and B, and it's been a fight to even get books by Caribbean writers on this list in a representation that is equal to, let's say, Shakespeare and all of the British writers and American writers who may not be as familiar to our Caribbean people, trying to get people from our culture on the list. And I use this analogy to tell you that change is slow and incremental. So no, I don't believe it's possible right now, because I'm going to be honest here and say that it requires the same advocacy engine. It requires the same kind of, the education system in the Caribbean is, especially the curriculum that is regional and that is governing standardized testing, is slow to change and has made and has so much impact in so many places that it's going to take a widespread sort of CARICOM focus to do that. It's not impossible, but, and I do see it happening in my lifetime. I think it's possible. I don't think it's that hard, to be honest. I think there's an issue of will and there's an issue of leadership that has to come with that. I think this is something that will require a certain type of, when we're talking about things like, these things are not exclusive to conversations around reparations or any of the things that are inherited, that are broader global issues about how we as small island developing states end up having certain cultural attitudes and certain legacies left behind. Those are part of the same conversation, and part of that conversation is restoring a certain kind of dignity to our education curriculum, and that includes advocating for all persons. I will say that even in that, heteronormative sexual education in the Caribbean in HFL is still incredibly problematic. So even if we're thinking about pushing, is the same layer I was talking about, right? At the level of heteronormative sex education, we still have so many. And I am a person from Dominica who exclusively went to Catholic schools from preschool to high school. So I can tell you that it is incredibly problematic in general as a recipient of that education and someone who teaches in that environment. So it is in our interest to begin an advocacy project around that, that is in tune with our efforts at the legal and in the terms of the more cultural. One of the things that I think is really, from the research perspective, I really push for two areas that are what we call more subtle and more pervasive. The intake forms and the normalizing of language that we use to talk to each other is really, really important, because once we start naturalizing the way we say they as a singular, or the way we say other, or how do you identify yourself, the way we normalize that in our speech changes the way we interact with each other. It doesn't feel so aggressive. We have to try to change the way we think and speak to each other on a day-to-day, like in the little granular things. That, and then also the terminology and educating people on the terminology. That's something that can be included in an HFLE curriculum, just in terms of terms and definitions and letting people know what they are. I would say start with those areas as a place to begin the curriculum transformation. But I am nervous. I don't think it will happen so quickly.
Yes. I'm sure we can continue this conversation all day.
Yeah.
We're filled in a room of passionate people talking about what we want to see true change and advocacy in. So I'm going to wrap up our panel discussion for today, or for now, this segment, when we take a break for lunch. I'm going to give my panelists opportunity to give one final word, and then we will hand back over to Dr. Wong.
I am here with just my fingers, just want to be snapping every second, because there's just so much that's you could hear, that we just need to hear this. We need to absorb it. We need to just take it with us. And I'm so happy about this project. And I was saying earlier to Alex that this needs to be replicated in all the islands. But what you mentioned earlier, where people are saying that we see so much being asked of us as LGBT people. Every time it's a study, what are we getting? We need to maybe highlight the benefits and some of the progress that's made a little more, but there's so much to change. Just as an overall, I like it. I want to marry the last comments that were made. The one person spoke about all the areas that we need to work on, including working with parents, working with teachers, working with faith-based organizations, working with policymakers. There are actually, and you also mentioned, Dr. Osprey also mentioned, in terms of progress that's been made in other parts of the world, especially when you look at global South countries, like we look at Latin America, we look at the African continent. There's a lot that we can pull from there. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. However, we have to understand, and marry the other person's comment, that we must take care of ourselves. We absolutely must take care of ourselves. When you're in a session like this, it's just like sparks are going off. There's so much. There is so much that can be done. There is so much to do. But ultimately, I just want to end with this exhortation for us to take care of ourselves. Because there's PFLAG in the US, which is Parents for Lesbians and Gays. We know there's sexual and reproductive health and rights curriculum that has been vetted and that teachers refuse to teach. It's there. It's just not being done. We know that faith-based organizations, they're Christian people, are LGBT people. We know all these things, and there's so much networking that we can do, so many networks to form. But ultimately, I just want us to remember we do as much as we can do, and individually in our space. Even when I say, we need to speak up in the spaces that we are, sometimes we need to, for our own peace of mind, our own mental health, to be quiet and take care of ourselves as activists and as advocates, and use when we are able to speak and we have the strength, we have the mental wellness, and we have the support to do so. Speak the work where we can use research like one's just been presented today with the CDS project. Do that as much as possible, but also to continue to take care of ourselves and take care of each other.
Okay, so I would like to end. I'll just add to what has just said. Basically, with all the information that I've learned or gained from Dr. Esprit and Ms. Michael and Senator James, so I would like to use all this information collectively and then push forward with the Men's Empowerment Network and ensure that I can get more advocated out there.
Awesome. And to our virtual panelists, I'm going to give you an opportunity to give some final words and comments.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank Decides Antigua and Barbuda and Women Against Rape for having me on this panel today. I know I was standing in discretion, but thank you so much for the warm welcome. This is a very useful discussion, and this is a needed discussion that needs to take place at multiple levels. It needs to take place in our homes. As was pointed out, it perhaps needs to take place in our schools and in our educational healthcare system. And it definitely needs to take place as well at a higher level in our legislature. And in order to effect change on the legal path, I just want to highlight again that, there are two ways to go about this. So we know how our laws are made. We know that process that goes through Parliament and how a bill becomes an act and therefore becomes a law. And so perhaps it is time to put pressure on our representatives and to call on our representatives to reflect the evolution that we're trying to push forward on a societal level as well. And separate and apart from asking our representatives to take that action, as activists, as on a grassroots level, as individuals, we also have that power to challenge the law and to seek clarity on the law. And as Dr. Esprit would have highlighted, and I would have said earlier as well, it is there are many opportunities where the law certainly has not been challenged in our jurisdiction in Antigua that are ripe for that challenge. And so it would take a brave individual or brave couple coming in good faith to challenge that law and to see where that takes us and to push that evolution forward. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and with that, I want to thank a very special thank you to everybody here today, especially my panelists and the organizations that they represented, as well as Dr. Esprit and the persons who would have